It is our pleasure to be with you today. So I'm Sandra Sancier-Sultan. I'm a senior partner with McKinsey. I'm based in Paris. And I will be also facilitating the panel that will follow our short presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Sandrine de Villard. I'm also a senior partner from the Paris office, and alongside Sandra and many others, we've been the mothers and some of fathers of our series of reports, Women Matter. And this year, very briefly, before we leave the floor to our three great panelists, we'd like to share with you some of our two latest reports. One which was presented, that were presented very briefly in the plenary. So. Oops, so I have lots of things in my hands. And indeed. So last year in Deauville, we shared the report that we've been leading with the McKinsey Global Institute called The Power of Parity. What we've done is that we analyzed 15 gender indicators in terms of inequality of genders. And they had to do with inequalities in the workplace, inequality in the economic opportunities, in legal protection and political voices, and in physical security and autonomy. And to our great disappointment, we found out that there were still huge inequalities throughout the world. Indeed, we surveyed 95 countries, and out of the 15 indicators we looked at, 40 countries had very important or important inequalities on more than 50% on the indicators. Still a very, very long way to go. Obviously, it differs by region of the world, but even in Western Europe, we found out that we were not at all at par on gender equality. And the biggest gaps were in everything related to work. So this year, we decided to focus on this aspect for Western Europe and to try to see how we can, really close the gap. Let me start by a few facts. Number one, we clearly demonstrated that, closing the gap on work for women would bring a wonderful and a very important boost to the economy. Indeed, we assessed that $12 trillion would be added to the global GDP. And for Western Europe, also, we're talking about 2 trillion. It means that in each country in Europe, increasing the GDP by 1 percentage point every year. It is massive. And how can we do that? We must work on two of the most critical gaps between men and women. The first critical gap is the gap which is linked to the participation of women in the workforce. Even in Europe, women are still underrepresented in the workforce. And the second gap has to do with the increase of female hours in the total hours work in a particular country. We're talking about part-time. And last but not least, there's also a third lever which is about increasing the share of women in high productivity sectors. Very often, in most of the countries of the world, women tend to be devoted to sectors with lower productivity, such as education and healthcare, and we're talking about bringing them to high-tech industry or finance. Let's focus on the first two gaps, which are increase in female participation rate and increase in female worked hour. There is still a huge gap in terms of part-time employment and unpaid work. If we look at part-time employment, what you have here, the little triangle, they represent the women, and the circle, they represent the men. And what you can see is that, for instance, in the Netherlands, you have more than 60% of the women who are on part-time, while you have less than 20% of the men. And if you look at throughout Europe and throughout the world, it is the same situation. If we focus now on unpaid work rate per gender, again, there's a very big difference. Actually, in Europe, we found that on average, women spend twice more time to unpaid care work than men. We're talking about taking care of the children, taking care of the elderly people, etc. For instance, in Europe, we're talking about 4 hours and 28 minutes for women compared to 2 hours and 18 minutes for men. And in South Asia, or in, for instance, Middle East, the difference is 5 times. So why is this important? It is very important because if we want to close the gap in terms of genders, we need to work on those inequalities. Also because those two elements are not always, out of willingness. It's also imposed on women most of the time. So, and what we found out is that also not only the household responsibilities are not equally shared, but what we just discussed about, but also the perception and the mindset regarding the household are very different. For instance, 50% of the women think that they do all of the housework, but only 1% of the men think that their partner does all the housework. So, perception is reality. I don't know. What was very striking also is that, sometimes men decide that they would do the unpaid care work by choice, while women have to do it. So when you ask the question, percentage of men and women who say that they do more housework because they choose to do so, you have 45% of men who say, yes, I chose to do so. And you have only 20% of women saying, yes, I chose to do so. So very big gap also on this front. Why is it important to close the gap and to go very fast? We clearly demonstrated that there is a link between the employment rate of women and women at the top of corporations. The more women in the workforce, the more women at the top of corporations. We also demonstrated that there's a clear link, but negative one, between women doing unpaid hours and women at the top of corporation, meaning the more hours worked by women and not being paid, the less women at the top of corporation. So this is very critical. So where are we now? And I will hand over to Sandra.
So where are we now? Let's look at some numbers. They come from the database we McKinsey have been building for the last 10 years now, of women in the top companies of each country, the companies that compose the index of each country, so that we have something that is comparable over time. And what do we see this year? So you have here the number of women in corporate boards and the number of women in executive committees. Do you want the good news first or the bad news? Which one do you want to start with?
Both anyway.
Bad news first. Okay, the glass half empty. Okay, for the glass half empty, we have a clear underrepresentation of women. We have 17% for executive committees, 22% for boards. This is very far from parity. And when you look at the countries which have imposed laws or official targets, yes, there is improvement, but we are not yet there. If you want to look at the half full glass, take the example of Germany. So Germany passed a law to impose, let's say, targets, both on boards and on executive committees. And Germany has moved from 3% of women in executive committees in 2012 to 20% in 2015. So there were quite a number of women hidden somewhere because they did find them. And that makes also a part of the story of significant improvement in Europe, because we have had an increase of 7 percentage points over the last 5 years. At the same time, I'm going to finish with a bit less optimism, because if you step back and you look at the time series, if we think that what we've seen since 2005, when we started that work, we have seen an increase of 1 percentage point per year on boards and 1 percentage point on executive committee, with an acceleration at 1.5 per year over the last 5 years. What does it mean? It means that gender parity is 20 to 25 years ahead of us. So that's a number of meetings like that, and that's certainly not acceptable. That situation might explain why women today are not very confident about their chances of success. Let's look at a few facts. The first one, which I personally love, is that contrary to widespread belief, women have the same ambition as men. You are seeing here the results of this year's survey of thousands of employees across Europe. And what you see is that 68% of women want to get promoted to the next level. It's slightly higher than men. It was true 5 years ago. We've demonstrated that in the US, and we've demonstrated that also across the world. So same level of ambition. When you look at, do I want to become a top executive? Same story, 48% for women, 44% for men. But if you take those of us who have the ambition to become a top executive, and you ask whether we are confident about our chances, then the number goes down to 25% compared to 42%. Why is that? This is not that women lack self-confidence. It is that they lack confidence on the culture and the environment that is around them, and how this culture and environment will be conducive to a success. Let's look now at what companies do to address these topics, these problems. Let's call them problems, which they are. What you have here is the result of a detailed benchmark of practices and pipelines that we have conducted with 233 companies across Europe. What you see is that more than half of these companies are actually putting in place a large number of practices to promote gender diversity. 52% implement more than 25 actions to promote diversity. At the same time, only half of them, 24%, are achieving some results. What we mean by results here is more than 20% women in their executive committee or at CEO position. And when you look at what employees of these companies think, you realize that they are very much aware of the fact that there is no progress. Because you see there that only 30% of employees think their company is committed to gender diversity. A very disappointing 12% think their company is doing what it takes to improve gender diversity. And even more worrying, the employees themselves we surveyed, most of them don't know how to act on gender diversity, 62%. So now that we have seen where we are today, let's have a look at what the best-in-class companies are doing. What are they doing differently from the others? And we found that there's 3 game changers. We found that they make a big difference on the numbers. And those game changers are, 1, the persistence. So that is a new findings, and we are very happy about that. When we looked at the best-in-class companies, a majority of them have started the journey more than 3 to 5 years ago. So persistence of commitment over time has a big impact. The second one is CEO commitment. And you'll see that CEO commitment, we've discussed that in a number of sessions. It's absolutely critical. It's also critical to see that commitment going down the line and cascading to the lower levels of the organization. And the third one is these best-in-class companies are actually organizing holistic change programs. They have a compelling change story, why improving gender diversity is a priority for the company. They have role models and change agents at different levels of the organization. And they are building a culture that is conducive to diversity. Just a few facts. Quickly, so to show you this, you see the...
We skip those two.
Okay, okay. You'll see the numbers. It's more a priority, and it's also more commitment. So what you see here is CEOs of best-in-class companies are much more committed than the others. So it's not only about having action in place, but making sure that they are really deeply implemented.
And just to finish before we hand over to the panel, how to make it happen. As Sandra said, it starts with the CEO commitment. He or she must be deeply engaged into gender diversity, monitoring the progress and really walking the talk, and needs to cascade this down the organization. You also need, as Sandra said, to have the true change story, why it matters for our company, beyond ethical reasons, why it matters for competitiveness, why it matters for performance. And everybody in the company must be aware of that, or this remains still a pet project. Then you have, obviously, just like in any change program, transparency and indicators in order to assess where the company currently is, in order to assess the quality of the implementation and whether it's moving the needle on gender diversity. You also need to work as women as leaders, because we see that there are all kinds of barriers that we demonstrate in our previous report, and also on the organization devising, in particular around one particular element, which are the leadership styles, and look at all your processes to ensure that they are gender neutral. Last but not least, you have a number of collective enablers, such as infrastructure, work-life balance, etc., etc. So indeed, there's no such thing as one silver bullet. It takes time and commitment and implementing this full ecosystem to make change happen. And very briefly, it's part of a continuous improvement. It's just a little bit, many companies have started with lots of ambition, have had some progresses, have let this down, and it's just like, if you've baked a souffle, as soon as you change the temperature or you open the door of the oven, the souffle collapses. So let's avoid that the souffle collapses. So with this in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Sandra and to our dear panelists. Please join us on stage.
So we have Patty Hajdu, the Canadian Minister of Status on Women. Patty, thank you for joining us. We are joined as well by Rohini. Rohini is the Senior Vice President and Global Chief of Diversity at Sodexo. And last but not least, our diversity man, Louis Desazars, who is the President and CEO of Shiseido Group EMEA. Thank you for joining us.
You're not a token. You're not a token.
So, as we are a bit pressed by time, what I will do is ask each of you a question and then open to the audience to have additional questions. Patty, can we start by you?
Sure.
You are very prominent and active in a field that is of high impact, as we have seen. I would love to get your views on how can we help having more women in the economy. What kind of public policies can be put in place to change the cultural dimensions and have more conducive environments for women to develop?
Well, thank you very much. And as you can see, I have a ream of notes from my staff, but I'm going to ignore them all, which is typical for me, because I really liked the features that defined the companies that were best in class. When you look at that McKinsey study, the three features that they identified that would actually drive change were persistence, CEO commitment, and holistic change programs. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we're hoping to head through those lenses. And so I'll start with the CEO commitment, because of course that was the shot that was heard around the world. And when our Prime Minister was elected, in fact, he was very bold in saying that he was a feminist. And he had made a commitment during the campaign, which I don't think received a lot of attention, because I don't even think I recalled this particular commitment, but that his cabinet would be composed of 50% women, that we would have parity in cabinet. And when he appointed 50% women to his cabinet, and made good on his promise, one of the questions, and I was lined up behind him when this question came forward by a reporter, was, well, why would you do this? Why do you think there were enough qualified women? Why would you take this step? And he said, because it's 2015, and it became a fairly famous catchphrase in our country and in other countries as well. And I use that example because that commitment that he has to gender equality, it's the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. And I know that most of you know about this, but as a new Minister of Status of Women, it is a visible demonstration that not only are we going to talk about the need for women in leadership, but that we're going to take every action that we have in our power to promote women to power, to promote women to the senior levels of our organization. The other thing that he did was to make my position a full-time position. So Minister of Status of Women in the past was tagged on to other very large portfolios like health or labor, which meant that, of course, those portfolios are so complex and so large that gender equality would often fall off the plate of that minister. Not because that person didn't care, but because the issues of the day were very dominant and gender equality would not necessarily be the priority. And so to have someone focused full-time and holding my colleagues accountable to implementing what we've committed as a government has made a tremendous difference already in a year. So I think that's a nice segue into the holistic changes model. So the holistic change program in our government is really driven through the lens of what we call in Canada gender-based analysis. This has been something that our government's been committed to doing, and I use committed in brackets, for a very long time. It's hard to do. What it essentially means is that every decision we make, every program that we create should be done with analysis for how it will impact women and how it will impact other populations of vulnerability. And in the past, many times people would tick off the little box and say, well, there's 50% men and 50% women, so therefore it is equal. And now with a full Minister of Status of Women and a renewed commitment from our Prime Minister to back me up, when policy goes forward, the appropriate minister or department must, in fact, do a much more rigorous analysis. And it is changing the way that we think about policy and programs. I could tell you a million examples. I don't think I'll go through that so other people have a chance to speak. But I can tell you at the very beginning, people didn't know how to do it. And where I sit in cabinet, with the decisions that would come forward to cabinet, they weren't done very well. But I'm tenacious, persistent, loud, aggressive, all the things that you have to be a politician. And I would say every time, this is not okay. My department would help me with giving me why it wasn't okay, and I could give them concrete examples of how to make that decision better or how to mitigate for the impacts that it might have on women in particular, what we could do alternatively. So the holistic change is that this is happening throughout government. And we have an incredible commitment on behalf of our finance minister for the first time ever to look at our gender and do an analysis, look at our budget and do an analysis of our budget using the lens of gender. This is the first time in Canada this will ever be done. So you can see that the holistic aspect will, I think, drive us forward. And thirdly, I really like this notion of persistence. This isn't going to happen overnight. Sometimes our opposition critics might say, oh, you did this policy, but in fact it's still harmful to women or it doesn't consider women. And my answer is, we're in year one and we will make mistakes, but we will get better and better and better because this is a long-term commitment. As long as we keep getting re-elected and the next incoming government, if we don't, has the commitment as well. But we have 4 years. And according to McKinsey, 3 to 5 years is the magic number. So we may be able to create a culture change that would be very difficult for other governments to either neglect or undo. And to me, that's that critical component of success. So I'm very excited to be here, and thank you very much.
And we are very happy to get your testimony. It's very impressive. Thank you for sharing. Mr. Desazars, your company is very successful in its gender diversity. I would love you to share with us, what are you doing? What is it special that you're doing to change the leadership style, to change the culture, and to make it conducive for women?
So, same as your conclusion, CEO role is crucial, in spite of the fact that 80% of our employees today are women. When I came on board a year ago, it was a big transformation that the Shiseido group is going through in the EMEA. and I had some key positions to fill, HR position, country manager position, and I was able, and consciously, I made sure that when we hired those positions, we had the choice between women and men. And I must say that now our head of HR is a woman. Our executive team is 40% women. In our country managers, so head of UK, head of France, head of Germany, head of Russia, who's here today, head of Austria. So we have a majority now country heads who are women. So I think it starts, it begins with the CEO, and this has been the case through the Shiseido history, especially in Japan with Mr. Watani. And then I think it's what is crucial is raising awareness and sharing the information that McKinsey is putting together, and rationalizing that parity is so important and brings so much to the business life and to the performance. And I was myself, in spite of I'm convinced about that, seeing numbers behind and backing it, I think is the best business case to change people's mind, and then making sure that there's a conversation going within the company. We haven't started yet, but this is something I really would like to begin, is making sure that this is put on the table, that people talk about it, because there's a lot of unconscious and conscious bias that exist, and misconceptions that exist, and I think having the conversation around it helps a lot.
Thank you very much. I must admit, I'm super impressed by the sophistication you all have on the topic. It makes us very optimistic. Rohini, you've been pushing this at Sodexo with amazing results over the years. You've also helped us at McKinsey and been an amazing partner for our research. I remember a discussion 5 years ago where you shared an example of how you tackle unconscious bias. I was very impressed. Can you tell us a bit more about what you do at Sodexo on this?
So I have to say I was a late addition to the panel, and I cannot say no to Sandra and Sandrine and Cécile, so I'm very happy to be here. And I think that overall, our journey, our Sodexo story really mirrors the research that you've shared, and the results have been very positive. I think some of you heard our CEO yesterday at the plenary session. We have 50% women on the board, 38% women on his executive committee, 30% in the top 1,200. So I think the results have been really good. And I think that part of it has been sort of an exemplification of your research, the CEO commitment. I mean, you're over here, you're demonstrating and role modeling your commitment to a lot of the women and men in your company. And similarly, our CEO has been very visible, has been very vocal on this particular topic. And he's also put out a target recently, which is that he wants to see 40% women in our top 1,200 ranks by 2025. And that particular target has been linked to incentives. So he's put it as a performance objective, so 10% of the bonus is linked to that. So first time we're trying that globally. However, we've had it in the States for several years now. And the other piece that you talked about was a data-driven kind of, rationale or logic, because I think that if this change process is linked to the values of one individual, that individual may leave, and then you go back to, okay, so why are we doing this? So we've developed a very strong business case around gender balance, and some of you may have seen that, but basically our sweet spot is 40 to 60% women on teams, and we find that women with teams with less than 40% underperform, over 60% women plateau, the performance plateaus. And we linked it to 5 of our key performance indicators, which, so it's not about the fact that one gender is better than the other. It's basically you need that mix, so you need the balance. So we linked it to 5 KPIs: engagement, brand awareness, client retention, organic growth, and gross profit. And every one of those KPIs, the gender balance teams outperform. So that became the sort of basis for the 40% target by 2025. And then I'll come to the question you asked. it does have to be a holistic culture change effort, right? It can't be the one silver bullet, as you said, Sandrine. It needs to be right from the recruiting to the development practices, to the retention, to the engagement. And actually on engagement, diversity and inclusion was the highest driver of engagement in the recent study that we did. And that's been a tremendous change for us. So we've looked at the representation, we've looked at the engagement, and the engagement has been, for us, that becomes the measure of culture change, if you will. So around the culture change pieces, clearly the recruiting is absolutely critical because we want to make sure that we have diverse candidate slates in order to select the best candidate. But then also around development. And we do have mentoring and sponsorship initiatives as many organizations do. But I'll share a very quick story on that because I think part of this has to be, you have to provide people with awareness. They don't know what they don't know. Epiphanies or some kind of learning, whether it's through training on unconscious bias, which is what we do, but also through reverse mentoring. And the example that I'll share is that we had a country head who mentored a woman who was responsible for high security facilities in Europe. And at the end of this particular relationship, he said, if you had presented me with two candidates, a man and a woman, and said, hire the best qualified candidate for this position, I would have likely hired the man. This is a high security facility. It is my unconscious bias that would have driven me to that particular decision. He said, at the end of this relationship with her, I will never let that happen again because she has a very different leadership style. She has, but she's extremely effective. She's low-key, she's not aggressive. You would not match that particular style necessarily with managing a high-security facility, but she is incredibly effective. So he said, I'll never let that happen again. So I think that's just one example in response to your question.
Thank you very much, Rohini. Now it's time for questions from the audience. So if you can just stand up, say your name and ask a question to one of our participants. Can we take one of the mic, maybe? Who has a question?
Hello, good morning. I'm Clémence and I'm working for the French Elle magazine on a program which his name is Elle Active. And which goal is to promote women at work. I would like to have your views on the French public policies on the women in work. And I mean, is there some initiatives that you would like to do in the Canada, even if I think you're going further than us on the subject? Thank you.
Well, I have to confess my ignorance in that I don't know what the French public policies are at all. But I can tell you some of the more detailed things that we're doing to drive this message across government. One of the things that I think we've done that reinforces our commitment is the Government of Canada has about 4,000 appointments right now in terms of public sector, Crown boards and tribunals. So these are our government decision-making bodies. And they govern things as broad as our ports, our airports, but they could also be judicial appointments. They can be panels, immigration panels. They can be social security panels. And we make decisions with these people who are everyday Canadians, qualified everyday Canadians. And we, since being elected, have made a commitment to an open and transparent process that's based on merit, but that is also ensuring gender diversity and diversity of other kinds as well. Canada is a multicultural country. We have our challenges just like every other country, but we believe these boards and tribunals should be composed of the people that they are governing for. And this is, again, I want to stress that it is merit-based. People still have to have the criteria needed to make the decisions on whatever respective decision body it is. But we are being very thoughtful about including women and women of various backgrounds to balance out what has been traditionally very much white male appointments. And this is changing, I think, not just, it's a very visible indication of our commitment to diversity, but it's also going to change the way those decisions are made. And I think about the Sodexo experience, I think that we will have, as we diversify these boards, better decisions that reflect the true nature of Canada. And it is a legacy piece. Thank you.
One last question.
Hello, I'm Mary and I work for Thales in France. And I have a question concerning the white angry male that we've heard a lot about recently, to both of you actually. And how far do you think all these measures have an impact on the other side, if I may, on people that have been in place that might feel threatened or not, and what to do about it?
So I can just, sorry? I can just answer really quickly on that. And clearly, initially, when we had put in place some of these measures and targets, there was a bit of backlash. However, what I'll say is that, and that's why you have to have a holistic approach. It can't just be one thing. It needs to be a whole culture change effort. And I will say that as we engage the culture and we started to shift the culture, I think that everyone came on board. And the way we did that was through the personal epiphanies and personal learnings and awareness, which is absolutely critical. But it's also through the business case. So when you had white male middle managers basically realize that this is good for my business, that I can speak with pride to my client about what I'm doing. I feel good being part of a company that has these shared values, and I can talk about it, and it becomes a differentiator and a competitive advantage. Then all of a sudden you have people on board. And they're on board then and then begin to open their mindset. So it's not one thing to unpack that resistance. It has to be multi-pronged, but clearly the personal experiences. And the other thing is people don't know what they don't know, as I said. So you have to give them the experience of what it's like to be a woman in the organization. And people don't intentionally do the wrong thing. So I think it's all of these things together.
The white male would prefer if I did it. I think it's an excellent question, actually. And I think it's the question of our time, in fact, is how do we work on inclusion and diversity and bring everybody along with us. And I think, quite frankly, it's something we're thinking about very seriously in Canada, because the last thing that we want is alienated anyone, regardless of what their background is. Having said that, I am conscious that whenever you shift power, that there is resistance. And I do come from the grassroots, where I tried to shift power in a whole bunch of different ways. And power is not easily relinquished. And I think we need to remember that, and remember that equality is not a given on any domain, and that in fact we must protect it as if it's our most precious resource, and it takes all of us. But I very much like what Rahina says about making sure that people see the benefit for them as well, and that people feel included in the work. I can tell you that at the cabinet process that we've been having, it isn't just gender. We have people of different, we have people with physical disabilities. We have 3 or 4 different faith groups. We have people that are from the queer and trans community, queer community. We have older people as old as 70 or so, as young as 31. And it is that diversity, not just gender, that's actually strengthening our team. I can tell you that I have never seen policy through the lens of a quadriplegic before. But when he provides a perspective of some of the barriers that he faces, I'm invisible to those. Those are challenges that I don't have. I'm fortunate to not have to face. But I watch them, not just through what he tells us, but what he goes through to do his job, which is in some cases infinitely more difficult than me. And yet he still flies domestic, and he still has all kinds of challenges just like us. And he shares those challenges just by living through them. And I think it makes us better at governing, because we can see the impact through each other's eyes. Do you want to add anything?
Thank you very much.
Not so much because we're 80% female, so we don't have so much this problem so far. So it's more the other way around.
Do you have time for one last question? There was one question here.
Hello, I'm Claire Duval from the Musée d'Orsay, and we have a women's patron circle, so we promote this because it's very unique in Europe. What do you think about feminine, women's circle within companies? Is it really useful? Do you see an impact in this field? Louis, do you want to answer that one?
I don't have the
Oh, you don't have
we don't have women's circles, so
Roini, can you do it?
I have a hard time.
And then I'll
So just very quickly, I think it's extremely valuable. We do see actually have several, not just women's. We have an LGBT one, we have a people with disabilities, we have a intergenerational one, so we have several, but we do have about 20 networks around the world. And I think it's extremely beneficial, particularly in terms of providing women a sense of community, a place to go to share. Now remember that these networks are open to men and women. It's not just exclusive to women. So there are men who are part of it as well, but they share, they help mentor each other, they share best practices around how they're managing work-life effectiveness. So it's been very, very beneficial. We actually measure the impact. So we look at engagement, productivity, and retention of those that are in these networks, and they're certainly higher than for the cohort population. So they've been very beneficial for us.
Thank you. I'm conscious of your time. I would just love one conclusive comment from, not comment, actually, suggestion from each of you. You've been truly inspiring and energizing. And as we are very energized, what is your advice to the men and the women in this room for Monday morning? What should each of us do differently on Monday morning?
I think it's the first time we participate to this forum, and for me it's been really very interesting. And as I said, we are in a full transformation mode, and I don't think I voiced to the company what strong enough what's my opinion when it comes to gender equality and the whole background behind all of that. So what I will do is really communicate more strongly around that, definitely.
I think I'd like to build on the last question that I answered, and I think it's really about building that culture of inclusion. We all have a responsibility here. These things can't happen without us working. If we're all thoughtful about inclusion, and if we stand up to long-held biases and fear, and all of us have influence in this room, and I think it's very important that we use our influence to protect those values that we all know not only are the human thing to do, but in fact are the economically beneficial thing to do for all of our companies and our countries. And so I just encourage everyone to stand up and fight for those things that we know are good for the world and good for our countries and good for our businesses.
Thank you. So I'll just build on that. And I do think that it's a privilege that we have in this room, and the privilege is that we can actually influence and be change agents. So I think with the privilege comes a responsibility, and I think every one of us in this room has that responsibility, particularly today. I live in the United States, and I will say that the work is never been more important than it is today. So I encourage all of you to really stand up and make your voices heard.
So stand up, communicate, fight for inclusion. Thank you very much for this amazing panel. And I know that you'll be in other panels, so you don't have more time. But thank you again, and thank you to you for attending.
Thank you very much. Thank you. On se revoit, bravo. C'était super, non?
Merci.